Hey everyone, welcome back to Stock Explorers. As always, we're here to help you make sense of the market and see where the opportunities might lie.
Absolutely.
So today we're going deep on Corcept Therapeutics.
Okay.
It's a biopharma company,
Yeah.
and their whole thing is modulating the effects of cortisol, this hormone,
Right. Right.
And they've actually had some pretty interesting news lately out of their phase 3 Rosella trial.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So that's what we're going to be breaking down in this deep dive.
Sounds good.
So Rosella, this trial was looking at Corcept's drug, Relacorilant,
Mm-hmm.
and they combined it with another drug called nab-paclitaxel.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave this to patients with a type of ovarian cancer that's resistant to platinum chemotherapy.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Like, you know how bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics? Well, it's kind of like that.
Right. Right.
You know, you need new options, right?
That's cool. So basically what we're going to try to do is explain exactly what happened in this Rosella trial and what it all means if you're thinking about investing in Corcept. We'll try to make it really clear, maybe with some examples and, so everyone can understand what this all means for the company going forward.
Yeah, great idea.
Okay, so the big news is that the Rosella trial, it met its primary endpoint.
Yes.
That's basically the main goal they set out to achieve in the trial. And it's a huge step towards, potentially getting this drug approved.
That's right. It's the make or break for a lot of these drugs in late stage trials like this. It really tells you, did it work?
Right.
And was it safe?
Exactly. So we're talking about a really significant study. This is, not just some early testing.
Not at all.
They're looking at Relacorilant plus nab-paclitaxel for these women with ovarian cancer that just hasn't responded to that standard platinum chemo.
So it's a really critical group of patients.
Exactly. And like you said, the primary endpoint, that was the key thing they were looking at.
Right. So what they found was, they met that primary endpoint.
Okay. So what does that actually mean, though? Like, for the patients, what did they see?
Yeah. So it means that this combination, Relacorilant and nab-paclitaxel, it actually showed a statistically significant benefit.
Okay. So, like, what kind of benefits are we talking about here?
So they looked at a couple of things, really important things when it comes to cancer treatment.
Okay.
First, they looked at progression-free survival. So PFS, they call it PFS for short.
Right.
So basically, how long can a patient live without their cancer getting worse?
Right.
And they found in the group that was getting both drugs, the median PFS was 6.5 months.
Okay.
Now compare that to the control group. They were only getting the nab-paclitaxel. Their median PFS was 5.5 months.
Okay, I see. So a whole extra month.
Right. And the statistical analysis showed that this difference, it wasn't just random. The hazard ratio is 0.70, p-value 0.008.
Right.
So it's like, it's a real difference. And, for these patients, that extra month, it's a big deal.
That's true. It really is. But, at the end of the day, the real question is, did they live longer overall?
Exactly. Overall survival.
Yeah.
That's what they call it, OS.
OS, right.
And what's interesting is they did what's called an interim analysis.
Right.
They looked at the data partway through.
Uh-huh.
And already they were seeing a significant benefit.
Wow.
In the group getting both drugs, the median overall survival was 16 months.
Okay.
Compared to 11.5 months for the control group.
So that's 4.5 months longer?
4.5 months, yeah. And again, the statistics back it up. Hazard ratio 0.69, p-value 0.012.
So again, that's a real difference.
It's not just chance, yeah.
Yeah. But one thing I always, I wonder about with cancer treatments is, are these benefits coming at the cost of, more side effects?
Right, that's a huge concern. You don't want to just, extend life a little bit, but make their quality of life horrible.
Right.
But here's the thing, the really amazing part of these results is they got these improvements in both PFS and OS without making side effects worse.
Wow.
So they're living longer, the disease is progressing slower, and they're not suffering more.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about how, this type of ovarian cancer is really tough to treat.
Right. Platinum resistant.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of good options out there.
So what do you think these Rosella results mean in that context?
Well, I think it really points to this combination Relacorilant and nab-paclitaxel. could actually become the new standard of care.
Wow.
It's offering a real improvement for patients, and it's not adding to the toxicity burden.
So you're saying this could be a real game changer.
I think it has the potential to be, yeah.
And for Corcept as a company, I mean, this has got to be a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
It's huge for them.
To have a win like this in a late-stage trial.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
really solidifies their position, especially in oncology.
Right.
It gives them credibility. And, they've already been doing pretty well financially. They've had almost 40% revenue growth in the past year.
Wow, that's impressive.
So this is just adding to that momentum.
Okay, so let's talk about that momentum. I mean, how did the market react when this Rosella news came out?
Pretty dramatically, I'd say.
Okay, like how dramatic?
Their stock price went up about 90%.
90%.
Yeah, almost doubled.
Wow. I mean, that shows you the kind of the confidence that investors have in this drug now.
Exactly. And it's not just about, the short-term excitement.
Right.
It really reflects a belief in Relacorilant's potential.
Right. So where does that put their market cap now?
Right now, it's sitting at about $5.7 billion.
$5.7 billion.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, I was looking at some of the analyst reports, and they're suggesting that the company might still be a little undervalued.
Yeah, that's what some of the analysis shows.
So there might be even more room for the stock to grow.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially as they hit those regulatory milestones.
So this move into oncology, it's a real diversification for Corcept, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they've been known for their work in Cushing syndrome. That's been their focus.
Right.
But now they're branching out into this whole other area.
Right, so they're not just a one-trick pony anymore.
Exactly. And that's a good thing,
For sure.
It opens up a whole new market for them, potentially a much bigger one.
Yeah. And it reduces their risk, right?
Exactly. They're not so reliant on just one thing.
So how do you think these Rosella results change the outlook for Corcept's growth going forward?
I think it's a big boost, you know. I mean, they're planning on submitting all the paperwork to the regulatory agencies, FDA in the U.S.,
Right.
the EMA in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
They're planning to do that in the third quarter of this year.
Okay, so pretty soon.
And, as we've talked about, there's a real chance that this combination, Relacorilant and nab-paclitaxel, it could become the new standard treatment.
Yeah.
And that would be huge for them, And their revenue projections for 2025, they're looking at $900 to $950 million.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It is, and that's even before we know how the ovarian cancer drug will do. And they're not stopping there. They're looking at Relacorilant for Cushing's syndrome, prostate cancer.
Right.
So they're really committed to growing and expanding.
Okay, so we've got these great trial results.
Yes.
What does that mean for getting approval from the regulators, the FDA?
Well, it's a huge step in the right direction.
Okay.
I mean, they hit both their primary endpoints, PFS and OS, both statistically significant.
Right.
P-value less than 0.05 for both.
Right.
So that's strong evidence that this treatment actually works.
Yeah.
And that's what the FDA, the EMA, they really want to see that.
They want to see the data.
Yeah.
And then wasn't there also some special designation they got in Europe?
Oh, yeah. For ovarian cancer specifically, Relacorilant got what's called orphan drug designation.
Right.
And what that means is, they get some benefits from the European Commission.
Like what kind of benefits?
Well, like lower fees when they submit all the paperwork. They can get some advice from the regulators and even potentially some market exclusivity if the drug gets approved.
So it's like a fast track, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. It definitely helps smooth the process.
So it sounds like they're in a good position, especially in Europe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And the success of this trial, it really validates their whole approach.
Okay.
This idea of targeting the glucocorticoid receptor, they call it GR for short,
Right.
to overcome chemo resistance. It shows that it can work.
So this could have implications for other cancers too?
Potentially, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what's the plan now? What are they going to do to get this treatment to patients?
Well, first things first, they got to get the green light from the regulators.
Right.
So they're going to submit the NDA, that's the new drug application, to the FDA here in the U.S.
Right.
And then the MAA, which is the marketing authorization application, to the EMA over in Europe.
And they're going to do that pretty quickly, it sounds like.
Yeah, they're aiming for the third quarter of this year.
Okay.
And they've actually been through this before with Relacorilant, but for Cushing's syndrome.
Oh, that's right.
They already submitted an NDA for that.
Right.
And they're waiting for a decision by the end of 2025.
Okay. So they kind of know the ropes.
Yeah, they've been down this road before.
Okay. And it sounds like they're working closely with both the FDA and the EMA.
Absolutely. The whole thing about using overall survival as a dual primary endpoint, that was something they decided on together with the agencies.
Okay.
So they're not just working in a vacuum, they're really collaborating.
That makes a lot of sense. And then they're planning on submitting to the EMA in Europe soon after the FDA here.
Right. They're trying to get, market entry in both regions at roughly the same time.
Okay, that's smart. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual design of a Rosella trial itself.
Okay, sure.
I understand there was something interesting about how they chose the patients for the study.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of times in these cancer trials, they'll only enroll patients with specific biomarkers.
Like a specific gene or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
But in Rosella, they didn't do that.
Oh, interesting.
They didn't require any biomarker selection for enrollment.
So anyone with this type of ovarian cancer could potentially participate?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so why did they do it that way?
Well, what it means is the results, they might apply to a much wider group of women.
Okay.
You don't have to have a certain genetic profile or whatever to benefit from this combination.
I see. So that's a lot of potential patients.
Oh, yeah. In the U.S. and Europe combined, there's something like 20,000 women every year who could be candidates for this treatment.
Wow, that's a big market.
It is, yeah.
So how does this compare to the trend in oncology towards, more personalized treatments?
Right. So there's definitely a big push towards tailoring treatments based on your individual genetics and all that.
Right.
And that can be very effective. But, sometimes it narrows down the patient population too much.
Okay.
So with Relacorilant, it's kind of the opposite.
Right.
It's more broadly applicable.
So it's kind of a trade-off, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with a personalized treatment, you might have a higher chance of responding, but only if you have that specific biomarker.
Oh.
Whereas with Relacorilant, it might work for a lot more people.
But maybe not as effectively?
Potentially, yeah. But on the other hand, it might also make treatment decisions a little easier.
I see.
You don't have to do all this testing to figure out if a patient is eligible.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to how well the treatment actually worked.
Okay.
Just sum up the key benefits, and then let's talk about what that means financially for Corcept.
Okay, so in Rosella, they showed that adding Relacorilant to nab-paclitaxel reduced the risk of the cancer progressing by 30%.
Okay, 30%. That's significant.
Yeah, and it also extended the median time before progression. But I think the most impressive result was the overall survival benefit.
Right, the 4.5 months.
Yeah, that's a big deal for these patients. It's real time.
It really is. And so how do those clinical benefits translate into dollars and cents for Corcept?
Well, a few ways. First of all, if patients are living longer and their disease is progressing slower, they're going to be on the treatment longer.
Right.
So that means more revenue for Corcept.
Okay.
And then because it's actually extending lives, in a situation where there aren't a lot of good options, they could probably charge a premium price for this drug.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it also makes it easier to get insurance companies and other payers to cover the cost.
Right, because they can see the value.
Exactly. So you've got a large potential market, you've got the ability to charge a premium price, and you've got good chances of getting reimbursement.
Right. So if this drug becomes the standard of care, we could be talking about a lot of money for Corcept.
Potentially, yeah.
So now, I'm sure a lot of investors are wondering, does Corcept actually have the financial muscle to pull this off,
Yeah, that's always a key question.
to bring a drug to market?
Yeah.
So what's their financial situation?
Well, as of the end of last year, they had over $603 million in cash and investments.
603 million.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It's a pretty good chunk of change.
It is, yeah. And what about debt? Are they carrying a lot of debt?
No, actually, they have very little debt.
Okay.
And that's really important because it gives them flexibility.
Right.
They're not, weighed down by interest payments and things like that.
So they can really focus on growing the business.
Exactly.
So you're saying that 603 million, that's enough to fund the regulatory stuff and potentially even the launch of the drug.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they've got to submit the NDA, the MAA.
Right.
And then if it gets approved, they're going to need money for marketing and all that.
Yeah.
But they're also investing in their pipeline. They've got Cushing's syndrome, prostate cancer, even ALS and MASH.
Wow.
So they're thinking long term.
Yeah. And they're also buying back their own stock.
Right, which is another sign that they're confident in their future.
Okay, so let's talk about that future. I mean, they've given some revenue projections, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they have.
What are they saying?
Well, they haven't broken it down specifically for the ovarian cancer drug yet.
Okay.
But overall, they're expecting big things.
Okay.
So last year, 2024, they brought in $675 million.
$675 million.
That's a 40% increase from the year before.
Wow, that's huge.
And this year, 2025, they're projecting $900 to $950 million.
900 to 950.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a big jump.
It is, and it suggests that they're expecting, big contributions from their pipeline.
Yeah, definitely. And that guidance, it takes into account a few things.
Right, go ahead.
Continued growth in their Cushing's syndrome business, for one.
Right.
They've got this catalyst study that's showing hypercortisolism might be more common than they thought in people with type 2 diabetes.
Interesting.
And they also had some issues with a pharmacy partner last year that they're hoping to resolve.
Okay. So a lot of moving parts, but overall, very positive.
Yeah, very positive.
So now in the oncology space, there are already a lot of treatments out there.
Right. It's a crowded market.
How is Corcept planning on competing? What makes Relacorilant different?
Well, their strategy really hinges on this whole idea of fighting chemo resistance.
Okay.
A lot of cancers, they eventually become resistant to the drugs.
Right.
And that's a huge problem.
Right.
And relacorilant, it works in a different way. It targets cortisol, which can actually help cancer cells survive.
Okay.
So by blocking cortisol, they're making the chemo more effective.
I see. So it's like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, exactly. They're using it along with nab-paclitaxel. So it's not replacing chemo, it's making it work better.
Okay. And that's different from how other drugs work.
Yeah, there are other classes of drugs like chemotherapies themselves, angiogenesis inhibitors, PRRP inhibitors.
Right.
But they all have different mechanisms, different targets.
Okay, and then how does it compare to that other drug we talked about, the mirvetuximab?
Right. So that drug is only approved for patients with a very specific biomarker.
Right. Right.
And that's one of the things that sets relacorilant apart.
Okay.
They didn't limit the Rosella trial based on biomarkers.
Right.
So potentially, it could work for a much broader group of patients.
Okay, but maybe not as effectively as mirvetuximab in those specific patients.
That's possible, yeah.
Yeah.
But we need more data to really compare them head to head.
For sure. So it sounds like Corcept is thinking beyond just ovarian cancer with relacorilant.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're looking at Cushing's syndrome.
Yeah.
Which they already have a drug for.
Right.
They're going after prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
They're really trying to expand the use of this drug.
Okay. So let's look at some of the financial metrics for Corcept. What can those tell us about the health of the company?
Well, one of the most impressive things is their gross margin.
Right.
It's almost 98%.
98%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's really high. It means they're able to, make a lot of profit on each sale.
Right.
And their operating margin's pretty good too, around 20%.
Okay.
So they're managing their costs well. And then their beta is less than 1, which means their stock price tends to be less volatile than the market as a whole.
So it's potentially a less risky investment?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
And then their forward PE ratio is in the mid-teens, which suggests that they're, reasonably valued.
Oh, yeah.
But their price to sales ratio is a little high, which might mean that the market has, really high expectations for their future growth.
Right. They're banking on big things.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about the stock itself, and what are investors thinking about Corcept right now?
Well, there's definitely a lot of optimism, especially after the Rosella results.
Right.
But there's also some caution.
Okay.
They've had a couple of earnings misses recently.
Right.
And there's still a lot of short interest in the stock.
Okay. So some people are betting against them.
Yeah, but on the other hand, there's also a lot of insider ownership, which is, usually a good sign.
Right. The management team is invested in the company.
Exactly. And then, the stock has been doing really well over the past year, up over 120%.
Wow. That's amazing.
So there's definitely some positive sentiment. And institutional investors, they owned over 80% of the stock.
Okay. So the big players are in on this.
Yeah, but there have also been some analyst downgrades recently.
Okay. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that.
So let's talk about how much Corcept is investing in their future. What's their R&D budget like?
Well, last year they spent almost $247 million on R&D.
247 million.
Yeah, and that's up from the year before. So it shows you that they're serious about, developing new drugs.
Yeah, they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. And a lot of that money is probably going towards Relacorilant,
Right.
for Cushing's for oncology.
Hmm.
But they're also working on those other drugs, the dazucorilant for ALS, the miricorilant for MESH.
So they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Right.
And when you look at their overall revenue, they're reinvesting a pretty big chunk back into R&D.
Yeah, almost 37%.
That's a strong commitment.
It is.
So their main product right now is Korlym.
Right. That's their bread and butter. It's for Cushing syndrome.
Okay. But is it risky for them to be so reliant on just one product?
Yeah. There's always a risk with that.
Like what?
Well, the patent could expire.
Right.
They could face generic competition, which they actually are right now.
Oh, okay.
So that's why their pipeline is so important.
Yeah, they need to diversify.
Exactly. And Relacorilant is, a big part of that.
Right.
They're hoping it'll be a blockbuster.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about their overall strategy, their business model. What are they really trying to achieve?
Well, their focus is on modulating cortisol.
Right. Yeah.
And they're doing that in a very selective way.
Okay.
Cortisol, it's a hormone that affects a lot of different things in the body.
Right.
And it plays a role in a lot of different diseases.
Like what?
Well, like Cushing's syndrome, obviously.
Right.
But also cancer, ALS, MAH.
Okay.
And what Corcept is trying to do is develop drugs that target the glucocorticoid receptor. That's where cortisol binds.
Oh, okay.
And they're doing it in a very specific way so that they can, avoid some of the side effects that you might see with other types of cortisol blockers.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, we've talked about the efficacy of their drugs, but what about the safety?
Right. So safety is obviously crucial.
Yeah.
And so far, Relacorilant looks pretty good.
Okay.
In the Rosella trial, it was generally well tolerated.
Mm-hmm.
No new safety signal.
Okay, that's good.
And in the Cushing's trials, it's also been, relatively safe.
Yeah.
And they're not just looking at, PFS and OS.
Right.
They're looking at other things too, like, how long the response lasts, the response rate, quality of life.
So they're really trying to get a complete picture.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about intellectual property, patents and things like that?
Yeah.
How strong is Cordycept's position?
Well, they've got a pretty strong IP portfolio.
Okay.
They own the rights to Relacorilant, and they discovered a whole bunch of other cortisol modulators.
Okay.
And they've got patents on the composition of the drugs, the way they're used, all that stuff.
So they've got it covered.
Yeah, pretty much. And they've also got orphan drug designation for Relacorilant.
Right. We talked about that.
And to all of you listening out there, if you want to stay informed about future developments in this story and other compelling stories in the world of finance and innovation, please be sure to subscribe, give us a like, and activate those notifications. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.